Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Christina Coleman, and I'm the Director of Public Programs and Hospitality for Plymouth Patuxet Museums, and we're thrilled to be collaborating with the State Library of Massachusetts tonight. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few announcements. First, please keep your microphone on mute throughout the program. This will help to eliminate any background noise for our speakers. If you have a question, you can type that into the chat, and we'd like to ask you to direct the question towards host. That is the actual name of the person that you're sending it to. There will be a time at the end where we'll be answering as many questions as we can. For the best view of the program, at the top right of your screen, you're going to toggle from multiple speakers and grid view to speaker view. And now I would like to introduce Beth Carroll-Horrocks, who will be introducing our speakers. Beth is the head of the Special Collections at the State Library of Massachusetts and has been since 2011. Working with the state librarian, Albie Johnson, she helped coordinate the repair and digitization of William Bradford's manuscript of Plymouth Plantation, and worked closely with colleagues at Plymouth Patuxet Museums to produce a new facsimile of the manuscript in 2020. And you may have seen that we did do a collaboration program then. So Beth.
Well, thank you, Christina, and hello, everyone. As Christina said, I'm Beth Carroll-Horrocks, the head of Special Collections at the State Library of Massachusetts. We're very glad to be here tonight for a number of reasons. One, because of the work itself and the author, but also because doing these virtual programs has allowed us to expand our audience tremendously and to expand where we invite our speakers from. So we're really glad about that. We're looking forward to seeing you all in the State Library once the State House itself reopens and our safety protocols are in place. But in the meantime, we're very glad to be here with you all tonight. So over the past few years, even before the pandemic, the State Library of Massachusetts has been working with our colleagues at Plymouth Patuxet on a number of different projects, including the one that Christina just mentioned, a brand new facsimile of William Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation. So we look forward to at least 400 more years of collaboration with these colleagues. So let me introduce our speakers. First, Richard Pickering, his affiliation with Plymouth Patuxet goes back to 1984 when he began working there as a colonial role player, a role he still occasionally plays today. He's currently deputy director and chief historian. And from my work with him over the past several years, I have to say that I've never met anyone who knows more about Plymouth, all facets of Plymouth, and can explain Plymouth and its people and what's happened there better than Richard can. So we're really glad he's part of this conversation tonight. Richard will be in conversation with historian Carla Gardina Pestana, whose latest book, The World of Plymouth Plantation, was published by Belknap Press in late last year. The Carla is, I have to read this title, it's a long one, Department Chair and Professor and Joyce Appleby Endowed Chair of America in the World at UCLA. And while her previous work focused on religion and empire in the 17th and 18th centuries, starting with Quakers and Baptists in colonial Massachusetts, the work she and Richard will be discussing tonight was inspired by a visit to Plymouth Plantation, as it was then called, a few years ago to work on an NEH-funded assessment of the museum's programming. So we've asked her to talk about that inspiration, about the structure of her book, how she did her research, and what she learned. So Richard?
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Beth. Good evening, everyone. It is wonderful to see so many familiar faces that we've been in conversation with before, and the privilege of being able to talk to Carla about her work. I I told Carla recently that I'm now on my third reading of the book, because what she has done is created this beautiful, her title encapsulates the project so perfectly, The World of Plymouth Plantation, because she goes deep into the colony, into the Wampanoag homeland, but then she goes broad and puts this colony within the wider world. So Carla, thank you so much for making the time to talk with us about the world of Plymouth Plantation. And could I ask you to go into detail about what exactly inspired you to turn your attention to Plymouth Colony?
Thank you, Richard. And I'd like to thank Beth for the introduction as well. And also to wish everyone a Happy New Year, because today is New Year's Day in 17th century England. March 25th was the beginning of the calendar year. So I'd like to acknowledge that fact as well. So a friend of mine told me this is the second book I should have written, as opposed to leaving Quakers and Baptists and wandering away from New England altogether, that this is the more capacious book about New England that I should have written as book number 2 instead of as book whatever number this is. So in some senses, I suppose that's right, that people write a book that's narrow and then they write a book that's broader, but really in some way about, you know, somehow related to the first one. But on another level, I think that's wrong, because I couldn't have written this book if I hadn't been thinking about the Atlantic world for the previous, you know, couple of decades. And so it was really coming back to New England, where I lived for a couple years when I was working on my dissertation, and which I've visited many times working on various projects, to go to archives, etc., or to come and give talks. But coming back to Plymouth and thinking about everything I had learned from other places, I think is kind of what, on some big level, was kind of what inspired me. The immediate reason to write this book, though, was that you invited me to what was then called Plymouth Plantation and is now Plymouth Patuxet, because you had brought together, I couldn't figure out what year this was. For some reason, it's not on my CV, so I couldn't look up when I had done this. But you invited a group of us to come and talk about Plymouth, and as I gather you've done on numerous occasions, to think about how the programming is aligned with the scholarship and the latest thinking, and to rethink that once again. And so I was one of the invitees. I think you mostly wanted me there because you were doing a skit about Quakers and you wanted me to watch that skit and give you some critiques of that. But I, of course, came to all the discussions, and I kept trying to bring in the wider context, and doing that in my mind and a little bit in the conversation just really got me thinking about how we usually think about Plymouth in terms of discrete vignettes of particular moments, or in the case of the Living History Museum, 1627 as a particular moment. But we don't connect it to other places. We don't really think about it in other kinds of broader contexts. And that intrigued me, and just, it kept nagging at the back of my mind that it was something I wanted to think about more. So when I had a moment, I did think about it more. And you know, the book was the result of that, which happened to occur to me a few years before the anniversary. So, you know, I've never written an anniversary book before, but that was another element of it, thinking if I do this now, I might be able to finish it in time for 2020, which of course was the 400th year of the Mayflower landing. So all of those elements were part of it, I think.
I have to say that your book is one of the products I am most proud of having come out of that conference 5 years ago now. And from those conversations, the museum has a new interpretive plan that takes on the entire 17th century, looking at major themes of risk and transformation of community. In conversation with Beth earlier this week, she said everyone who attends the state library conversations, is particularly interested in the work that historians do, the way they gather their resources, the way they read them. And so she wanted to make sure that you and I talk about what you looked at, how you were gathering your sources, for what really is, as we move on to talk about the structure of the work, something I find so innovative. But what were you looking at, where you were researching, and what travels might you have done in planning the book?
Well, I had a really great travel plan that never quite worked out, which was to go and walk all around the Cape and all through all the areas that are, that are discussed in the book. That was my dream moment, would have been to, be a sort of what I guess would have been a partially urban hiker, and just go through all these places. I never quite managed that, but of course I have been all over Plymouth and all over the region, having lived there. And of course, multiple times visited Plymouth Patuxet. But mostly the research was, I have to confess, the easily available sources about Plymouth. And I say easily available because I work where I have access to a major research library. So, easily available to me, I realize is not necessarily generally true. But I got all the things that were written around Plymouth in its first couple decades, by people who were there, by people who wrote about it, by people who were nearby in the very early period. I didn't go back and reread all the things that were produced in Massachusetts over the course of this whole history, but some of the very early writings out of Massachusetts I reread as well. And so I was looking at court records. I was looking at, obviously, I was looking at Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation, although sadly, I sent the book off before the new edition of that monumental work was available to me. So I was using other versions of Plymouth Plantation. I looked at the published things by people who had been there. The couple of early tracts that are written in Plymouth and sent back to England to be published, the sermon that's delivered in Plymouth and is published. So I looked at all of those sources, but I looked at them in a different way. I looked at them with an eye for what kind of connections do they talk about? Because that was what I was really interested in. I was thinking, and before I did that, I read all the secondary sources I could get my hands on, all the things historians and popular historians had written about the early years in Plymouth. And then I went into the primary sources, and I just made lists of all the ways in which I saw Plymouth as being connected. And then I had pages and pages and pages and pages of these lists. And then what I had to do was think, okay, how am I going to organize this? Because, I can't, you can make the case for connection just by looking at the lists, but you can't really make a book out of those lists. So, it was a big struggle to figure out how to structure it. So it made the point about the connections without, quite frankly, I hope it achieved the goal of not being boring. In doing so,
Not in the slightest, Carla. And I have to say, let's talk about that organization you achieved, because you so beautifully move from planning phases and conceptions of what a plantation is deeper and deeper into the story. And for those of you that haven't yet read the book, and I urge you to read this book, it's also available on audio, and one of the most beautifully performed audible performances I've ever heard. What you will see is the book is structured around trios of essays that point towards a larger theme. And the book begins with a trio that starts with wives. And again, readers have said to me, Carla, that meant so much to them. Why was it important to begin with wives and to particularize the Plymouth experience that way and put it in a broader content of what's happening in the other colonies?
Well, I mean, I floundered around about how to organize the book quite a lot. So I would say that it's likely that Wives wasn't going to be the first chapter at one point. But what I finally realized was there was a way to do this so that it moved out from the most basic thing and kind of from there went to the more kind of complicated, distant, less immediately connected to the, so I started with the planning. If you're planning this kind of an undertaking, what are the basic components? And then, if you're going to such a place, what do you take with you? So I was kind of envisioning it kind of moving out from the smallest and most fundamental point out from there. So that once I had that idea and I had decided that I needed to keep my what I call in the, I think in the introduction, triptychs, like the 3-part paneled images, kinds of people and then ideas and things. So I just cycled through a kind of a person, an idea, a thing, and I over and over again on each of these different levels. And as soon as you think about what is the most fundamental thing about Plymouth, it is in fact that it is a place where not just men are going to make profit, which was a typical way for people to go from England out into the wider world, but it was a place where families were going, where they were intending, as in the language of that day, to plant. They were intending to transplant English culture, English society, English lifeways to a different location. So all over the early modern world, there are English or Dutch or Portuguese or Spanish outposts, which are like trading posts. The most famous ones now are the West African trading posts where slaves would be collected before they're put on ships in the transatlantic slave trade. But these are all over Asia as well. They're places where companies go and establish an outpost because they want to buy spices or silk or whatever. So that's a kind of typical way to go out into the world. That's what the Virginia Company was thinking at first when it went to Virginia. And Plymouth knows it's not that from the very beginning. It knows it's bringing small children, not just ship's boys, not just servant boys, and it's bringing women, it's bringing families. And so that set it apart from other things that had happened up to that point and marked it as a certain kind of undertaking. And so in that regard, I thought wives were really important. But then also, wives are important because of what they signal to the people who are already there. If no ships that had visited prior to that had women on board. Always before, they'd been fishing ships, exploring, kidnapping, they'd been doing other things, but they hadn't actually had women and children which signaled a certain kind of agenda and a certain attitude toward what they were up to. So in both those regards, it seemed to me that wives were really fundamental.
Do you think that the presence of women signaled something to the Wampanoag people looking from the shore? What do you think that meant?
Well, I think they thought they knew what an all-male group meant because they'd encountered a lot of them by that time. And they might have meant just trade, but they could also mean hostility. And they furthermore meant temporary. Up to that point, they'd only been temporary visitors. So I think the presence of women both said, these are not people that are just here to gain something and then depart. These are people that are making a long-term commitment, and they're making it with women and girls, which indicates that they're not immediately thinking of themselves in sort of aggressor terms. I mean, obviously the presence of women is going to mean population growth, as I say in the book, babies. Babies come with wives, and that's going to be a problem for natives over time. that the population is going to grow, and people are going to want more land, and that's going to lead to more conflicts. But I think in the immediate moment of arrival, the presence of women is more comforting than it is alarming. And I think that's important, because the native peoples know who's on that ship and who's getting off and perambulating on the shore and then getting back on for some time before they even come on shore and begin to build their structures. So they are already well aware that these are not just, this is not an all-male undertaking of the sort they're familiar with.
Were there women that stood out to you, individuals in their personal experiences that were particularly remarkable?
Oh my gosh, when I thought about the childbirth experience on the Mayflower, which a couple of women experienced, I just thought, oh my goodness, it's hard to imagine anything more. I mean, it must have smelled terrible. It was, it's hard to get privacy. It was, it's uncomfortable. Below decks, it would have been dark. I mean, that part I think really struck me. And I think in general, the experience of going there in those first years would have been quite a struggle. I mean, these women were mostly, some of them probably had farm wife type experience in their background, but these were mostly urban women as far as we know. They hadn't been in the situation where there was nothing to be bought to support their families, that everything had to be either done without or produced in some way or waited for to come on in a later ship, or so I think it would have been a really challenging and difficult undertaking for everyone, but I think in particular for these women.
You beautifully deal with how community gets built. And what I love in particular is the way you look at how Bradford constructs of Plymouth Plantation and the 2 volumes and an increasing memory and awareness. Could you talk about the way you handle his growing understanding of the compact's influence?
Do you mean in particular the Mayflower?
Yes,
compact?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that struck me about the Mayflower about the Mayflower Compact was, first, when you read all the histories of Plymouth, you realize this was the favorite thing about Plymouth in the 19th century. That is, if you read, what people who are giving speeches or writing books or writing journal essays or whatever about Plymouth, looking back on it in the 19th century, they love the Mayflower Compact. They see it as such a fundamental document in US history. They see it as tying Plymouth to the American Revolution. They emphasize it deeply. And that has become less important in the writings about Plymouth. I mean, it's often acknowledged, but it's not emphasized in everything that's written in modern times in the same way it was back then. So that was the first thing I noticed. And then when I was actually looking at Bradford, I realized he doesn't even mention it when he narrates the history from the Protestant Reformation in England up to, coming ashore in New England. And he has a certain narrative arc in that book 1. He has a certain kind of story he wants to tell, which is sort of where do we come from and what do we mean? He's trying to make the case for that. And then when he goes to book 2, which he gets to in the 1640s, and he's now going to make a more prosaic record of like things that have happened. These are the events of, year by year. Here are the letters we received. Here are the people who visited. Here are the things we worried about. Here are the, so it shifts in its tone. And when he starts book 2, he says right at the first, I have to back up my story because I skipped something in effect. And then he goes back and he explains the signing of this document on board the Mayflower before they came ashore. And the reason why he does that is because well, there's really two reasons. When he first writes, he doesn't think it's important. By the time he writes the second time, he realizes it's one key piece of what they're relying on to justify having their colony. Because technically it was never a colony with a charter. It never actually had the whole panoply of legal support from England that other places did, most other places. So, you know, they landed, they were supposed to be in the Virginia Company grant, the Southern Virginia Company of London grant, and then they ended up landing in Plymouth instead. And so then they were outside of that grant. They were actually in the Northern Virginia Company grant, the Virginia Company of Plymouth, which they hadn't had any negotiations with. So they're going into a place where they have no legal basis for being there, and they are not going to be under the jurisdiction of a company that they have a relationship with. So they decide they need the Mayflower Compact to create some basis for how they're going to organize themselves in the short term. And then they try to get themselves a colonial charter, and they get various things. They get a kind of land grant from the Council of New England, which may or may not have any authority to give it to them. They gather what they can, but in the end, they don't have the kind of gold standard of a, Charles I saying, yes, this land, I'm giving you this land, which I, by the way, don't own, but I'm giving you permission to be here. So because they don't have that colonial charter, and because they're now in the midst of all these other places that are starting to get founded by other English people, and they want a kind of basis for defending their own jurisdiction, their own boundaries, they now need to have some basis of government. And so he goes back and he basically grabs this document that was signed on board the ship, and then he grabs some other things that they've gotten since then and kind of pulls them all together to make the basis of a kind of legal basis for actually being physically there. I think it's when Edward Winslow becomes governor that he gathers everything up into a book, all the like legal documents into a book, and he opens it with, we have this civil combination, we have this agreement with the Council of New England, we have this, like he goes through and sort of like says, here's the basis of our presence in the pride of place first opening pages, where in, say, Massachusetts, the book says, here is our colonial charter, let us recite it before we then launch into having our government. So Winslow, like Bradford, knows they don't really have that, so they need to kind of cobble together something. And in that context, this signed document becomes very important, although they never do call it the Mayflower Compact. That's something that gets added later. They don't even mention the name of the ship.
No, that's true. No one learns it for 3 years until the land records are made. Do you see a relationship between the combination signed aboard Mayflower and the fact that many of those aboard ship are part of a Christian covenanted congregation? Do you see the influence of the religious covenant on the civil covenant?
Well, that would be one place to go. And that would be something that the people who had been in Leiden would have been aware of, that you can join together into a church and create a community by gathering together and agreeing to be a community. So they've had the people who are there, very few people who were in Plymouth were there at the beginning when the church was first created. They lose a lot of those people over because of time, because some people stayed back in Leiden, etc. So, most people's experience of being part of the Leiden church was joining a church that already existed. But that is one model. And the idea that there are also civil models for contracting together. Other kinds of agreements that they could also have had in mind. the kind of things investors might do to join a company, to come up with an agreement to be part of an undertaking together would have been another model that they would have been familiar with. The Colonial Charter was basically the way Virginia was governed until the Virginia Company was canceled by the king. So they could have had a civil model as well as a religious one. But of course, the important thing there is those are not just members of the Leiden Church. Those are also what are sometimes referred to as the strangers, the people who are picked up in England and added to the community because they have some skills usually that the community needs, or just because they add to the overall numbers.
I'd love to, before I open it up for questions from people, I'd love to talk about the last two trios in the book. So where you talk about building community and you have servants, separatists, and furs, because for all of us at the museum, as we are really trying to explore 17th century spirituality in the lived experience of the layman or the laywoman, your handling of separatism and that label being put on these people as one that is not accepted by them. Could you explore that idea? To me, it's so important, and everybody at work was so excited about your handling of that topic.
Oh, well, that's great. I'm glad it was helpful for people's thinking. Well, I do think that the most fundamental thing here is that they are Reformed Christians. They are dedicated to the Reformation of Christianity that produces the Protestant Reformation that produces all these churches, but they're also dedicated to the kind of the Calvinist wing of it that's has a great emphasis on certain components, the gathered church, the importance of the word, the de-emphasis on ritual in favor of direct engagement with the Bible. So they're a certain kind of Protestant, and they share that with lots of other people. They're similar to the Dutch Reform. They're similar in some regards to the Presbyterians who will create the church in Scotland. They're similar to the people who will rebel against the Church of England and get labeled with the nasty term Puritan. But they go further in a political stance, which is to say they separate themselves. They gather their own church and decline to meet with the Church of England. And in the context of England, when they do that, that is a radical move. And that labels them, that links them to people who have critiqued the Church of England and stated basically that it's not a true church, that they shouldn't belong to, that no one should belong to it, that you can actually harm your spiritual chances if you join the Church of England. So at the beginning, they have taken a political stance that is extreme, but by the time they've gone to Leiden and then ended up in Plymouth, their position has become less extreme. And it's done that for two reasons. One is that their beloved pastor, John Robinson, who never did leave Leiden and join them in Plymouth, becomes more willing to interact with members of the Church of England over the course of his career in Leiden. So he tells his congregation that it's okay to be in communion with those people. It's okay to hear a Church of England minister preaching. So he's not taking the most extreme position himself. So it's a kind of softening of the very extreme stance that founding the church in the first place seemed to herald. So he's a well-regarded theologian, a very well-educated and well-regarded man, and he's in dialogue with lots of people who have a variety of positions on these kinds of issues. So he doesn't, in the end, signal to them that they need to be completely intolerant of any other way of of doing this, i.e. they don't need to totally reject the Church of England. So from a kind of theological point of view, that groundwork is laid by him. But then also it strikes me that once you're in Plymouth, what does it matter? Like, there is no Church of England in Plymouth. So your kind of political position of opposing the Church of England in England kind of fades away in the Netherlands, where, you know, that's not really an option. And certainly in Plymouth, where your church is the only church. So however you organize it is how it's organized. So, you know, there's that issue, it seems to me, that's kind of softens the point that they're making. And in general, I do see these people as being relatively tolerant of other slightly different views. They're very strict with themselves in the sense that they believe that they can't even fully organize their church until they get a well-educated minister. And they go for quite a while without a church minister, with only a deacon, before they get someone who has a university education and the kind of background that Robinson says is necessary. And that is not a radical position. That is a kind of a more, I mean, because there are, by this, you know, not too many years after this, there are these very extreme, you know, if you're a charismatic preacher, that's all that matters. It doesn't matter if you've never, you know, been to university or whatever. But in that regard, they think the learning is important. And that William Brewster, even though he went to university, never finished, and therefore isn't fully qualified. So he can be their deacon, but he can't be their pastor. So they have a strict view of what's important with regard to that, but they have a more, it seems to me, a more open view about various theological positions. Now, Thomas Morton, their big enemy, tries to say that they are rabidly anti-Church of England and that they disliked him because he was pro-Church of England. But I think he's making it up on some level, because that's not what they're fighting about when he's there. He's using that as a way to ruin their reputation with the Archbishop, who he's hoping will punish them, as opposed to really describing, you know, all the things they argued about, which had to do with a variety of other offenses that he was perpetrating.
I want to make sure we have the time to talk about books, which is how you wrap up everything to put in a broader intellectual world. But all day long, I've been thinking, I want to talk to Carla about some of the scamps that appear in the world of Plymouth Plantation. So could you just give people some background on the Lyford and Oldham controversy, who John Lyford was, and really the how it strikes at the heart of the church experience there, and in some ways strikes at the meaning of baptism too.
Well, I mean, Lyford, so John Lyford comes to Plymouth a few years in. He's sent by the investors who are still involved with the plantation, and he comes expecting that they'll take one look at him and realize that he has an education and that he's a reformed-minded clergyman, and that they'll appoint him as their pastor. But he does have a promise from the investors that they'll at least pay him as a teacher. So he comes with his family, he has servants, he has a wife and children, and he comes out and immediately becomes involved in the community, of course, and goes to the church and joins the church and gives what may be a somewhat uncharacteristic declaration about his faith and about how he's sorry for all the sins that he's committed, about which he's vague, but he talked about how he's going to, you know, he wants to dedicate himself to this Christian community, and it's it's remarked on in the records that he does this. Now, it's not clear if it's remarked on because this is just untypical in that time to join a church in that way, with that kind of protestation about his sinful past and now his, Reformation, etc. That becomes a fairly common way eventually in, say, the region over the next decades. But it's not clear if it's already the practice and he's just one example, or if he's doing this, introducing this as a way to kind of tell his bona fides and make himself, clearly a member of their community. But it gets reported because it turns out to be so untrue, basically, over time. And what it turns out is the case is that he had been a minister in a Reformed church in Ireland, where he had been involved in sexual assault on one of his parishioners under the worst possible, well, I mean, what are the worst possible terms? But he's asked by a man if he, as the minister, believes that the young woman that the man wants to marry is a proper wife for a devout man. He's basically asking in his kind of clerical capacity, do you understand her to be a godly woman? And he interviews her privately, at which meeting he rapes her. And then he goes back to the husband and says, yes, she is a godly woman. You should take her to wife. And then when she is married to the man, he finds out what happened. So Lyford loses his job, goes back to England, gets connected up with the Plymouth people, and he decides going to Plymouth is a good thing to do because it puts him far away from this trouble that he's been in before. And so he comes to Plymouth, I argue, to try to escape his past. He does a bad job of that because he immediately starts fighting with people in Plymouth in a way that draws attention to himself so that they eventually dig up his past and it becomes better known. In addition, of course, his wife, his long-suffering wife, knows not only what happened in the previous church, but she also knows that he's always harassing the maids. They have young women who are serving women working in the household, as better off people did at that time. And she says that he, even when they're just sleeping at the foot of the couple's bed, he might, have inappropriate relations with them. So, he's not, and she doesn't say anything at first, but when all this starts to come out, she describes to her new friends in Plymouth what has happened in the past, and also what has been going on since, and that basically undermines him in terms of the criticisms he's been making against Plymouth Church, but it also ends up him being kicked out of the colony. His compatriot is John Oldman, and he is actually not implicated in any of this, but he is a supporter of Lyford, and he does want with Lyford to join in and create a new church within Plymouth at one point, and that is also unpopular with the people in the plantation. So he's famous because he's later part of the reason, or part of the at least excuse for the Pequot War, because he'll leave the region, then he comes back and he's involved. He's murdered on the Connecticut River, and that's one of the events that leads to the Pequot War.
And the two men actually, their actions and the response of the colony explode the company, that there's so much division that scandal completely changes the economic course of Plymouth. Your handling of books to me is so meaningful, because one of the advances that you make in helping people understand Plymouth is that they were not parochial. I think there is a perception that these were corn-fed people and not necessarily well-read, but in your handling of the libraries, you put them in a broad world of understanding. So could you talk about how the probate inventories are revealing of the books that people owned, and really where they stand within a knowledge of the classical world and of, up to the moment, Renaissance politics as well, from what they're
Right.
reading?
Well, it's typical for Protestants in this period to be literate, and to be familiar at least with the Bible. And there are a lot of Bibles in Plymouth. And that, I think, is kind of the popular image, that that's what they would have read. But if you look at what's in their book collections, that only begins to describe what kinds of books they have. Brewster has a magnificent collection by the time of his death. William Brewster, he has more books than John Harvard, who donated his books to what would become Harvard College at his death in Massachusetts, around, in this same period. So he has a huge collection. He actually produced books when he was in Leiden. Briefly, he had a printing press and he produced books. So he's clearly very engaged in literacy, in book ownership, in keeping up with what's going on in terms of the printed word. And it's clear from his collection that he not only brings enormous numbers of books, but he gets more books after he's in Plymouth. So you can see that books are coming to him. People are bringing him books when they travel. People are sending him books when they can't travel to Plymouth. So he's got a magnificent collection of books, and he's loaning them out, we can see. There was an important discussion of this. Bradford basically borrowing his book, his Seneca, his copy of the Roman, account that's drawn from Roman history, and Bradford didn't own it, but Brewster owned it. So, and you can actually see that he's borrowed it because he's referencing it. So we know that books were borrowed. They're bequeathed. They're considered extremely valuable to individuals. It's funny, some of them, like Brewster's own sons, don't seem to care that much. Like, they don't want to own the most books in the colony, but other people clearly do, because when they break up his collection, other descendants of original Plymouth arrivals end up buying them. So like Miles Standish's son ends up with some of them, and so you can track that these collections, as they kind of break apart, might then like come back together into other people's book collections. So books are clearly really important and make them feel, I think, connected to what's going on, allow them to keep up with the latest ideas and news. I mean, Brewster, as the deacon, had lots of religious books that would have helped him, I think, in preparing his sermons and, thinking about, his duties to the congregation. But there's lots of other kinds of books. There's histories, there's kind of up to the moment political events in some of the things they get afterwards. There's theories about government. There's all kinds of things that are sort of typical, I think, of Protestant readers, well-educated Protestant readers within England. I mean, these are the kind of books that these men would have wanted to own. Somebody brings John Smith's description of New England, which had come out a few years before, and this makes John Smith really mad, because he says they should have hired me to come and guide them. They should not have just tried to rely on my book. But they own, a big variety of different things, and they clearly use them. But they also, and this I think it's easy to forget, but super important, they also produce books. They write things that they then send back to England, that then are published and are preserved. Plymouth Plantation survived in manuscript and had, an interesting story of how it disappeared and came back to light. But you know, most of what else we have from that early period, we wouldn't have, except that it was sent to London and published, because we don't have the original Good News from New England. We only have the published version. So, you know, it's super important for us to be able to tell the story of the first decades in Plymouth, that they did actually feel that what they were writing was important enough to send back to England and have it published.
Before I open up for questions, we have a question from Beth, and she asked Carla if you could describe some of the triptychs and how you organize them as you moved through.
Okay. Well, this was really hard. I always find how to organize a book is the hardest, is the hardest challenge. So first I had to come up with the idea of people, ideas, and things. And as I said, I had huge lists, and I was, you know, so I started dividing, like grouping and dividing, and you know, so I had to then look at that, and people, ideas, and things circulating in the Atlantic world is something that, you know, is a common way for us to think about that history. So I thought about those, you know, if I tried to group into those three large categories, would that work, and what would I lose? And I didn't end up losing anything that I felt terrible about, so that was good. And then, you know, what survived, then I had to figure out, you know, which ones, because the book could have been quite twice as long. But I figured if I wanted people to read it, it needed to not be twice as long. And then once I had done that, and I had decided that you don't just want to read all the things, then all the people, then all the ideas, you want to intersperse them. Then I had to think, what's the way to organize them into these triads or triptychs, as I said. And I decided that I ended up thinking of it as like dropping a pebble in a pond and then having it ripple out. So I was like, what's the very central, most basic thing that's going on here? And that was the first one. And then the farthest out one was like, what's the most connected, out there, kind of really engaged, far away from, you know, Plymouth category that you could come up with. And so I tried to do it kind of that way. It's kind of over time, but it's also moving out from the center, was sort of how I organized it. So, you know, it has, I mean, I separated them into categories that are like looking ahead, so planning what they're going to do, bringing along, taking things with them, first encounters, meetings, and exchanging. So I kind of went, so those are kind of chronological, but they're also kind of moving out from the most basic to the more complicated or profound. So I, you know, that's how I ended up organizing it.
I've monopolized your time, so I want to give people the chance to ask some questions before we hand back to Beth to say goodnight. Tom, could you feed us a question or two, please?
Yeah, we have a few nice questions here that have come in. Suzanne had an interesting one. She was, you know, I think we can safely estimate that about half of the passengers on Mayflower, the saints and the strangers, sort of as you were talking about before, Carla. And Suzanne was wondering about how many ships then traveled to Plymouth to bring more members of the Leiden congregation to Plymouth, and about how long did it take for them to build their ranks?
Well, there are a couple of additional ships that come over the next 5 or so years that have people from Leiden. But other ships come too, you know, ships come not only with Leiden people, they come with other people. So there's always an influx of both categories, both saints and strangers, to use that that juxtaposition. They never move, they never relocate the Leiden church fully. It continues to have members in Leiden, and it eventually, after Robinson dies, it eventually goes out of existence, And it appears that the people who are there that don't travel away end up becoming members of the local Dutch Reformed Church, which would have been theologically very different. And with enough time having passed, the language barrier was probably less important by that time. So that helped as well. So I think the last ship that comes with people from Leiden is 1626, but I'm not positive.
And,
We've got time for one more, I think, Tom.
one more, sure. Stephen was asking if there was anything really, it's actually a two-part, but one kind of maybe for each of you. He asked, was there anything really new or surprising, Carla, that you learned throughout your research? And if so, will that change any of the practices or interpretations at Plymouth Patuxet museums?
Well, what I learned might not be what changes what Richard does. Well, I didn't know the Lyford story, certainly, which I've just recounted. I mean, I knew they had a theological fight about him, but I didn't know they had the depths of his ignominious past. So that was a bit of a surprise. There were a lot of things that I hadn't really realized about Plymouth that I mean, I think I knew the standard narrative and I knew all the vignettes, but there were so many details. And I'll have to say, I assumed that they were more alike than different to other places I had been studying in other locations. And I did have that largely confirmed in doing this research. They really hated Catholics, though. Let me tell you, that comes out really clearly, which wasn't a surprise given who they were, but was somewhat interesting given their reputation and the fact that, you know, Boston eventually becomes basically an Irish Catholic town in part of its history. So,
and for the museum, Carla's handling of separatism matches our thinking and gives us a beautiful language for making that thinking accessible to the general learners. Because for me, what was so exciting was to be with Carla, who just, her work is stellar, absolutely stellar. And to be part of her first reaching out towards a general readership and to do it so effectively is just, it was gorgeous. So I thank you for that, Carla, because you have helped us find ways of bringing messages to the general learners who visit the museum. So I think at this point, I'm going to hand back to Beth to say good night.
Okay, well, I'd like to first thank both of you, but also echo what Richard just said about how Carla's book draws the reader in. And I suspect that, like me, many of the people who listen to your conversation tonight will read Carla's book and learn so much more than they ever expected. And I know you've talked about the structure of the chapters a couple times already tonight, but I'm hoping that if I give you one example, it will help entice all of you to get the book and read it. So just, again, chapter 1, looking ahead, as Carla mentioned. And then within that, she's got a section on wives, a section on plantation, and a section on guns. And it all pulls together so beautifully, and all of the chapters work the same way. So I strongly encourage all of you to read it if you haven't yet. So I hope everyone in our audience tonight will feel welcome to visit the State Library once we reopen. We're not exactly sure when that's going to be, but I hope it's soon, and you'll be able to find out from our website. Our website will also tell you about our services, our resources, and our really great collections, including the Bradford manuscript. So if you go to mass.gov/LIB, that will take you right to our homepage, and you will see, among many other things, a link to all of our resources about the Bradford manuscript and a link that will allow you to read the entire manuscript in Bradford's original handwriting yourself, in a digital version, of course. So thank you, Richard, and thank you, Carla. I learned a lot tonight and enjoyed every minute.
And can I just say that the book will be available? It can be purchased online through plymouth.org. I think we're putting that link in there as well, because this really is something everyone should read. It's glorious.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you,
And thanks
Carla.
to everyone for attending. It was nice to see so many people had come in for this event. So